Hey, welcome to the January program of the Larchmont Historical Society. I'm Ned Benton. I'm one of the board members of the society, and I'm a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Our topic today is about slavery in Mamaroneck Township. Mamaroneck Township is approximately what the town of Mamaroneck is today. Of course, there wasn't any Larchmont. And so we're talking about a place that's a bit different from what we know of now. I'm not a historian. I'm a professor of public administration, and I guess I think every professor is a bit of a historian. You can't study anything without getting a sense of history. But if you would ask what discipline I bring to this, I run a master's program about oversight and inspection of public agencies for waste, fraud, and abuse and corruption. And so I guess I'm an investigator. And I've been investigating who were the slaveholders and where were the slaves and what happened. And so this is the preliminary report of my investigation. I'm going to organize the report in three broad areas. One is chronology and demographics. A second is the slaveholders. And a third is the slaves themselves. Sources. There's a lot of sources, and I don't know whether you can read this or not, but I'd say there are some important ones that at least I find very important. There's a terrific book by Edward McManus on the history of Negro slavery in New York. There's a terrific collection of statistics on the population of the province of New York. These are statistics on the demographics of the colony before the Revolution. So they're the English were producing these. There's the United States Census. There's the Larchmont Gazette, which did an early series, which I was involved in, on slavery. There's slavery.larchmonthistory.org, which is the Historical Society's archive about slavery, and I'll show you a bit of that. This is a website, Slavery in the North. It's a terrific resource. There's the James Fenimore Cooper Society. And we have with us today Judith Judy Spikes, who has several books on Larchmont history. And I've told her that she is invited to raise her hand and to expand on anything, because I usually check everything with her. And if I haven't got it exactly right, or if there's some important thing that people should know, now's the time. It would be great. Feel free to raise your hand.
I'm sure you've got it right.
Well, time will tell. So if you say that afterwards, I'll be very pleased. Then we're going to be going to Canada because some of our slaves went to Canada. And so the Black Loyalist Heritage Society in Canada and several scholars in Canada have been very helpful here. So the chronology really starts with 1626, when the Dutch West India Company introduced the slave trade to New York. And in 1698, we have our first recorded census that identifies people holding slaves in what we know of as Mamaroneck Township. They were Captain James Mott, William Palmer, and Anne Richbeld. And they were recorded as holding slaves at that time. Now, this is the whole story. If you memorize this, you can go home. It is the picture of the demographics of slavery from 1698 to 1820. And it's every single, for Westchester County, and it's every single census that I could locate, whether it was the federal government or the British or town records or any kind of records I could find. And so you can see the black part of the bar is free, and the blue part of the bar is slaves, and the numbers on top are the numbers of slaves. And one thing I think you should note, look at this period right here, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, but notice that you'd think, well, it's the very top of it, but the numbers are what you'd need to see. The numbers are what are relevant. That's the numbers of slaves. But you can see that there was a jump in the number of slaves here from 1338 to 3430, and that was the peak in terms of the number of recorded slaves in Westchester, and then it goes down again. Now, this is the census of Westchester in 1712. This was done by the British government. And they refer to a place, let's go right here, it's called Mamaroneck. I guess it was his brother Sam. But anyway, now we know where the name come from. We all of these Indian things, it was really named after Mo. But in the 1712 Mamaroneck census, there were 84 people, 9 of whom were slaves. And this tells us, there were 72 male slaves under 16. There were 72 female slaves, 16 and above. There were 62 female slaves under 16. There were 127 male slaves from 16 and above. So that's breaking down the numbers that you saw in that other chart about the numbers of slaves in Westchester. This is one of the source documents for that big table, the big graph. Now, this is a composite of the 1790 census. This is the first census that the United States did, and they did it everywhere, and so they did it here. And you can see that the categories, that right there, the word is slaves. And so the United States identified 57 slaves in Mamaroneck in 1790. Now these are all the names, and so you say, how do I know the names? Here are the names, and I look down here to see who had the slaves. And so that's one of the ways that we know, and we'll be going into that in some detail. Now, here is a table. You might ask, well, who had more slaves and who had fewer? And so I took 1790, and I did a little bit of calculation here. So what we have here is we've got the total population of a bunch of counties. And then I have Mamaroneck Township. Then we have the number of slaves, and then we have the percent. So our biggest slave-holding entity was actually Brooklyn. Kings County, 32% of the population was enslaved. 32%. That is higher than most of the places in the South at various times. I mean, this is a huge number, and actually there is a Brooklyn Historical Society presentation that's going on that actually is struggling with that fact, because I don't think people realize that Brooklyn, I mean, if you think of slavery in New York City, Wall Street was the market, but where they actually went was Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. There wasn't a lot of slavery there was some, but the proportion, as you can see, New York City, it was 7.17%. Now, you can then say, well, Westchester, where were we? We were 5.91%, but Mamaroneck Township, we were twice the average in terms of the percentage of population enslaved compared to the rest of Westchester County. So, we weren't sort of a minor, we were kind of we were more intensive. Now, going on with respect to the chronology of the slave trade and slavery, 1771, the Quakers adopted a resolution against slavery. They just said that it should be abolished, and they said that the local councils should do it. And we had a community of Quakers, and so, there were Quakers in Mamaroneck and in Westchester who began to, if they weren't already opposed to slavery, began to really take actions in opposition to slavery, although some of them were somewhat puzzling. Slave trading was outlawed in 1788 in New York, and that's going to be an important factor in some analysis we're going to do in a little while. In 1799, there was a state law for the gradual abolition of slavery. And, Jonathan Ryder last week in his book presentation here talked about why we can't wait. And, when it came to abolishing slavery, they first tried to do it in 1785, and the Assembly passed something, but the Senate wouldn't pass it. Finally, in 1785, and finally in 1799 they do it. But notice, the males were to become free at age 28 and the females at 25 if they were born after July 4th, 1799. So it was like, we're abolishing slavery, but not quite yet. Till then, they would be the indentured servant of the mother's master. And slaves already in servitude before July 4th, 1799, remained slaves for life, although they were also reclassified as indentured servants. So it's like they abolished the term slavery, but they maintained the factual condition. This was the graphic there is of the actual law. Now, the question we have is, was this emancipation? We think of the movie, The 12 Years a Slave. Well, what happened to that man in the movie was illegal. But in the time period we're speaking about, it was perfectly legal to go sell your slave down in New York City, and the slave traders would take them down to the South. In fact, if in the 1780s, based upon economic studies of slavery, the trader could make a profit of $6,000 in today's dollars per slave. And so there was a lot of press, to say to people in Westchester and in other parts, your slave is going to be worth less and less and less, but if you do something with me right now, I can pay you quite a lot. And so slaves were getting valuable. Owners avoided the ban on the slave trade by disguising purchases as leases or indentures. I'll show you a picture of a Larchmont slave who was rented out to someone upstate. I mean, he was rented, and that's what they said. Free blacks were victimized, and the New York MANUMISSION Society rescued 33 blacks from these various kinds of fraudulent schemes and apprenticeships where they were maintained in their condition of slavery. Now, this is a scholar he's a City University of New York professor, and but he wrote a book on the history of Negro slavery, and he thought that in the period after 1800, that there was a decline in the number of black people, and his view was that they were basically being kidnapped or sold either illegally, and they were going down south, and that there was a drain on a lot of slaves. I think something more shocking. Remember that blip in the chart where we saw the increase in slaves and then the decrease? Originally, I thought that must be a mistake. You look at a chart and you see one bar that's sort of out of whack, and you say there must be a typo or something. But that chart, what I did was to try to see, first of all, whether the blip was true for white people, which would be true if there was a mistake, and also whether it was true for some other county or whether someone had made a calculation mistake. So I took Suffolk County. I took on going out towards Long Island. And what we see here is for Westchester, between 1756 and 1771, we had a 156% increase in slaves. There was a 47% increase in slaves in Suffolk. That was a huge increase for a short period. But this was a period in which we also had a 45% increase in non-slave people and a 26% increase in Suffolk. So there was a proportionality to this. And then the drop, if there was an error, why would you have 5% increase in non-slaves and a 64% decrease in slaves in Westchester in this period from 1771 to 1786? And why would you have a 9% increase in white and then a 30% decrease in slaves in Suffolk? What explains You know, where did the 2,180 slaves go from Westchester in those 15 years? Well, here's the question. Were they freed? No. In 1790, there were only 358 free non-white persons in New York. Were they sent to Canada? We'll get into sending the slaves to Canada. A bunch of slaves went to Canada, but I'm going to say it might have been 12 or 15 from Westchester that went to Canada after the Revolutionary War. Were they sold and sent south? Well, I think there's reason to believe that that's exactly what happened. In 1771, a New York Constitutional Convention passed a resolution urging future legislatures to abolish slavery. In 1785, as I told you, the Assembly passed a law abolishing slavery. And as I said, there was high demand for slaves if you would sell them to slave traders, to just take them down to the market in Wall Street, and they could send them to the South, and you would make a lot of money, and they would make at least $6,000 in profit. And the slave trade was not abolished, was not outlawed, until 1788. So a New York City Wall Street slave market buyer representing the southern markets could pay much more than a Westchester owner would ever pay or rent, or that a slave, a slave would be worth if someone was trying to reckon the value. And so I think that there were several thousand people like the man in the 12 years a slave who were basically sold from Westchester County down to the southern plantations, where I would think the conditions would be considerably worse. I mean, in terms of what, yes?
But he was a free man when he was sent down south. He was tricked.
I know. What they did to him was illegal. But what they did to these people was legal, which I think in a sense is even worse, yes.
I think also another factor to add to what you're saying is, it seems to me that in the North, very early there was a diversification, an economic diversification, where the South continued to be very, very agriculturally based.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you. It seems like people in the North saw this as a quick way to make a lot of money, and people in the South would be more than willing to take them.
Right, yeah. Okay, we'll keep going here. Now we're going to talk about the slaveholders. Now some of the names are going to be familiar to you. Why would that be? You'll learn about the Griffins, the Delancey's, the Monroes, the Richbells, the Palmers, and once again the Delancey's. And if you wonder where the slaves might have lived, well, you might go to the intersections of the streets that we named after the slaveholders. But this is a list of all of the names of the slaveholders that I've been able to identify. Now, there are more names that I'm working on. My investigation is not complete. And my problems are that I have some lists in which they attribute the person to both. There'll be a list of Scarsdale and Mamaroneck together. And I can't figure out which were the Scarsdale people and which were the Mamaroneck people. I have those kind of problems, but they need to be further researched. But we'll look at some of the names. Here's a big one. John Peter Delancey. Now, this picture right here, this is a cropping of a picture of the mural in the Mamaroneck Library, featuring the wedding of James Fenimore Cooper. And that's John Peter Delancey. And then behind him, of course, this is a picture from the 1930s, but you can imagine that the painter, in researching the question, made a point, because these are people that some of the records speak of the waiter, some of the family narratives about life in the Delancey household speak of the waiter. And so, there's your first effort at a picture of a slave, but there will be more. And this painting is from the Fenimore Art Museum. It's by John Wesley Jarvis. It's from 1814. But that's an actual painting from life, whereas the other one is not, although I think that the painter who painted the mural kind of must have seen this and probably was sort of wondering what it might have been like. Now, this is the Delancey's home back when it was on top of Heathcote Hill. And then this is a picture of the Delancey's home now on the Post Road. It is the restaurant La Piccola Casa. And so it's this building that's still there. In fact, there's some thought about tearing it down, and there's a controversy about whether it should be torn down or not. But it's one of our, if there's a rationale for keeping it, the rationale might be that it's one of the few buildings in the town of Mamaroneck that actually housed slaves. And we know who the slaves were, and we know when it was. Now, the Delancey slaves, there are many of them, but this is a list of the actual names that are recorded in documents. So these are the actual names of some of the slaves that they had, and we're going to get to know them a little better in a short time. Well, Joseph is sometimes referred to as the waiter. He might have been the guy in the back, in the picture. Now, Susan Cooper, in 1883, wrote a memoir about life in the Delancey household, and she wrote about the waiter, who I think is this person inspired that picture. Harriet was a cook. And I think this is also from the library, and I think this was inspired from Harriet. And Henry was described as Harriet's son. And now, John Peter Delancey. Now, this is a Judy Spikes question. Sometimes I find that people say that John Peter Delancey's father was somebody different than Peter Delancey, but sometimes I find that they show that he was the Peter Delancey, which would be this Peter Delancey, Esquire, who operated a mill. Now, it's recorded as being part of Westchester County, but that's because back then the Bronx was part of Westchester County, much of the Bronx. And so the mill that Peter Delancey, which is John Peter Delancey's father, until Judy proves me wrong, but certainly as a relative, it's the whole family crew. He operated, his slaves were named Honeyball, Tom, Tim, and these are the names, and I have not included them in the big list because they're not in Mamaroneck, but they operated Delancey's mills on the Bronx River. And these mills, basically, if you think of the Bronx Zoo, and the Bronx River going through the Bronx Zoo, south of the Bronx Zoo on the Bronx River was where Delancey's mills were. That was the Delancey property in the middle 1700s. Now, let's go to the Palmers. The Palmers, there are a lot of slaveholders in the Palmer family. I've just gone through and identified it. Every instance in which someone in a Palmer family is holding a slave and what the name of the slave is. Now, some of these people didn't live in Mamaroneck Township, but what I'm offering to you, some of these do. I'm offering to you the evidence that the Palmer family was a very large collection of slaveholders. And so you see all kinds of names of slaveholders, even though in 1790 we see them only holding two with Mary, and then in 1800 Elihu, and these are the only ones that are in the United States Census directly attributed to here. This is an example of a British census, and what you've got, you have the Palmers, Nehemiah. You've got Benjamin Palmer. You've got, you'll meet the Griffins later. They're here. So you've got a collection of Palmers here that own slaves. Now, I'm putting up a map that Judy will recognize because it's from her book, Images in America, Larchmont. And this is a map of Larchmont in 1716. And basically in 1716, Larchmont belonged to the Palmers. And Samuel Palmer basically gave to his sons 4 slices of Larchmont. And Nehemiah, we certainly know is a slaveholder. We have him documented as a slaveholder. The others are less clear. I also think for B. Weintraub, I have a realtor question. I notice up here that if you drive up what is now Chatsworth, you get up to a hill which is referred to as Rattlesnake Hill. And I just wonder whether the realtors ever thought of, saying I have a 4-bedroom Tudor in charming Rattlesnake Hill. It's a great place for kids and pets. Basically, it's a wonderful, charming place name for part of our community. Now, here's another leading citizen of our community. You'll recognize this is the Manor House. And who lived in the Manor House in 1790? Peter J. Monroe. And he was John Jay's cousin. John Jay's nephew, right. Okay, thank you for reading my words. He maintained in his legal residence in New York City, and he reported 4 slaves in his New York City census there. He appears in the town records as setting a female slave, Candace, free in 1803, and the birth of one of his slaves in 1814. And so there's two entries that are from him in our local records. Now the Motts. The Mott family is the mill, the Pryor Manor, the mill on Pryor Manor. And this is another from, this is Banjo Billy and Ginny, which are actual images of the actual slaves that lived with the Motts. This was a picture they had on their wall, and probably made by the same person who did this one of Richard Mott. And then this is the house today. This is a picture from at Red Mill, Mary McGahan's book, and you can see it happens to have a black person who I think is inspired by the fact that they had several slaves, even though they were Quakers. Now, it's hard to analyze the slave records of Quakers because the Quakers didn't necessarily believe in all this stuff about the state laws of recording people and all that kind of stuff. And there was an expression called Quaker freedom, in which the idea was that you were free simply because the Quakers chose to regard you so. And that there wasn't any point to setting you free because it did nothing but complicate your life, but you were in fact free because, you were owned by them. You were in fact probably more free being owned by them than you might be if you were set free and then you were kidnapped or whatever. And so there were just different views about this, but there was but right here, what we see in 1810 is James Mott has 3 slaves in the census, in the United States Census. Now, perhaps 2 of them were Banjo Billy and Ginny, who were really grandparents at then. They were family friends, and it just probably wasn't, But furthermore, these are from Judy's Images of Larchmont book. This is the Premium Mill, an illustration, and this is the mill house in 1903. James Mott in 1811 did this in the town record. I, having purchased Joshua Purdy, a Negro man named Andrew, who is about 26 years of age, he has the promise of a person I bought him of, that he should be free at 28 years of age, and as one object I had in view in the purchase was to secure his freedom. I do hereby declare the said Andrew to be a free man from the date hereof, Mamaroneck, 15th of May, 1811. So here, he buys the slave to free him. And so it's an indication that the Mott family, while they were slaveholders, I wouldn't say that they were necessarily in the same category as some of the other families. Now, these are certificates of manumission, and these are town records. I don't mean some distant town. I don't mean a town that, it's the town of Mamaroneck records. You can go get these you can go into the clerk's office and go into the closet there and pull these records out. But these are people freeing people. And no, they don't. Although typically, the observation was they don't have last names. Typically, the last name was the surname of the slaveholder. But they didn't bother with that, since that was something that was, that I think they considered obvious. But these are manumissions. Now, the thing about manumissions is that if you had a slave and you wanted to sell the slave in some informal way to a slave trader who could pay you lots and lots and lots of money, you couldn't say you sold him. You couldn't say he died. You could say he died, but then if it was not a natural sort of, if you couldn't prove it was a natural cause, that wouldn't work. And so one of the things that would be done is to simply declare that you'd freed the person and they went down the road. And so I would surmise that, I can't say how many, but I would surmise that in some instances, these slaves were not being freed. This was a cover for a sale to a trader that was going to take them down south. It just happened too often but how many of these would be this way? I'm sure some of them were people that were, they'd earned their freedom in one way or another and were freed. Now, we wonder where they lived. Where were the slaves? And one technique, and we'll just briefly run through this, is to look at, this is a map of Larchmont and Mamaroneck in 1868, and I'm just going to show you some places where people with slaveholder family names resided. And so here we're going to look for the Palmers, and here they're all over the place. Palmer, Palmer, Palmer. You've got lots of Palmer. You've got lots of Palmer. Purdy. You've got Purdy. Where's Purdy? Where did he go? He's in here somewhere. Where did he go? Oh, wait a minute. I think he's over here. Oh no, he's up. This is a sort of a Chamber of Commerce list. Here's Jonathan Purdy, who's a builder. And then Griffin. Well, the Griffins lived up north towards Scarsdale. And so you've got Griffin, and so you've got a Griffin Road up there. Then Rogers, let's see if we can find the Rogers. Rogers is an interesting name, and we'll meet the Rogers again, J.T. Rogers. You'll meet the Rogers in a little while. Now, Jedney, what do we have here? We have a Jedney hardware shop. Gray, now this is a guess here, but would Rector Gray of St. Thomas Church? There was a slaveholder Gray 50 years before. Haddon, we have a Haddon, a builder. And Delancey, now look at Delancey. Here's the Delancey's property that we looked at. The one, this is Mamaroneck Harbor, this is the Post Road. That's the Delancey property. But you've also got Delancey Point and Delancey's Neck. And so, the Delanceys are big time in this area. And so, now the Heights. The Heights, you're going further, this is Washingtonville, this is the railroad, so this would be the area of the train station in Mamaroneck. And here's the heights going up. E height and merit are both listed as slaveholders before, but these are these people, obviously these people at that moment didn't have slaves, but their grandparents may have. And they may have, they may be the descendants, and so this may be family, we don't really know, but it's right. I'm half done. So now we get to it's a great time. This is now where we're going to get into who the slaves were. First, over here, this is an interesting painting. In the Delancey household, there's reference to a picture that included a slave. And at one point in one article we did in the Gazette, we speculated on who the slave might be, and someone from the Fenimore Society wrote us and said, I know exactly, and this is this, and that is that. And we got the whole story. This man is Joseph Stewart, and he is the man. He's been rented to an upstate family. He was rented because they couldn't sell him, so they rented him to an upstate family. But this is this is a Cooper. It was sort of in the Cooper family. This is a Cooper aunt. And then this is Banjo Billy and Ginny. And then these are pictures from the library in Mamaroneck. But these are really the surviving pictures that we have of slaves, and two of them are actually contemporaneous. This was a real sitting, and this was a real sitting of two of our slaves. Now, the Historical Society is building a roster of slaveholders. It's slavery.mamaroneckhistory.org. And what you see there, this is the current state of our list of slaves. and so you can see it goes, so I'm not going to try to show you the whole thing, but if you go to slavery.mamaroneckhistory.org, or if you go to the Larchmont Historical Society website, you'll see in our collections, one is our slavery collection. And what we try to do is to aggregate everything that we know on that site. And so everything we know about every slave and slaveholder, we try to put on that site. Now, these are the names of the slaves. These are 60 slaves who we've been able to identify by name in the official record. Now, this is probably, I think, the most, well, a very important and I think meaningful document in our locality. This is the record of black children born since the 4th day of July, 1799. So when they did the gradual emancipation law, it was necessary. Now this is the whole record, and we've actually digitized the record, so this is what the first page looks like, and there are 5 more pages. But that's it. That's the whole record, and we're going to look at it. Now let's go back to that law. The law said any child born of a slave after that time was adjudged to be born free, provided nevertheless that such child shall be the servant of the legal propriety of his or her mother, until such servant, if male, shall arrive at the age of 28 years and female 25 years. So what it's saying is, if you're a woman who's enslaved and you have a child, your owner will go to the town and fill out this register, sign this register, and acquire 25 or 28 years of your servitude under state law. Now, this is simply, the next thing here is significant. What this says is that if the person wishes to, the person can, rather than taking ownership taking the right to the child, the newborn, can abandon the newborn legally, at which point then the newborn child is considered a pauper and is bound over to the overseers of the poor of the township, which basically means, and then the overseers of the poor then can lease out people who are paupers for service. So, I mean, think of what the position of the enslaved woman is. I can choose to, I can't choose, but two things will happen. My owner will take possession of my child for 25 or 28 years, or abandon my child, in which case, without any time limit, the child is indentured to the government to, and the government can take the child away. I mean, it's a very cruel law, an excruciatingly cruel law. Now, what I want to do is to go through, in the manner, in a sense, I view it in the manner of the way we memorialize the soldiers who died. I mean, this is a document which brings together the slaveholder's female slave, that slave's child, and the clerk of the township in a single paragraph, acting to enslave the newborn baby for 25 to 28 years. That's what we're doing here. That's what's happening. And this is a document that exists. If you go to the town clerk, Lynn and I went over and she got it out. It was just in the closet right next to, it's in the records. It's an official record of our government. So here's the first one. This is Gilbert Budd. Now, Gilbert Budd is one of the largest, he has the most slaves in Mamaroneck Township. He's the record holder. And he happens to be the clerk of the township. He's the town clerk. So he's the person who's signing these things. Now he's signing it for himself. He's signing as the owner and he's signing for himself. So he's signing Phoebe. Now here's Charlotte. Now Charlotte is, Esther is owned by Charles Duncan. Duncan basically had property north of, sort of where Staples is today. And so this is Charlotte and Esther. And then here's Peg. And this is Edward Merritt taking possession of gin. And this is Daniel. Phoebe is a slave of John Peter Delancey, and you can see there is the guy. And then he's doing, this is a twofer, because if you look over here, we're going to see Phoebe, or we're going to see Henry. And so he was registering two separate people in the same paragraph. Then here's Sally. I don't know much about William Thompson. And Peter. Now this is Gilbert Budd again, doing it for himself. And here's Sarah. And this, in this instance, Delancey identifies the father also. William. Now this is Duncan again, the one who lives where Staples is. And this is Plato. Now this is a very curious document here. David Rogers is a physician. And David has slaves. In fact, he had more slaves in 1810 than he had in 1800. And so he was you know, if you have more slaves as everybody's getting fewer, you're probably not, you know, doing it because you have uncertainty about what you're doing. But what he's doing here, he's abandoning all rights he has. Now, he doesn't even name the mother. I mean, it's like this creature showed up on my doorstep and I want nothing to do with him. Now, I suspect that, you know, somebody knows who the mother is. I mean, at one point I thought that this was one of the good guys. But I've now come to the conclusion that he's probably not. But it's hard to tell. It's possible that he was basically saying to the mother, your child is not going to be a slave. But on the other hand, you know, he's using the language of the law that expressly says that the child's a pauper and can be taken away. This question is whether he's the father, and I can't answer that. But
Excuse me.
yes.
Who would raise these babies? They were only a year old when they were taken away.
Well, they wouldn't be taken. Well, I have no. First of all, this is the only recorded instance I know. And I think that probably they would stay with the mother, and at some point when they could be put out for useful labor, they would be taken away. Which I think would be a point of leverage for the slaveholder onto the mother. You know? Let's see, this is Charles. This is another Gilbert Budd. Tom Pott, and Tom and Nanny Pott. Now, they had last names, and they belonged to John Peter Delancey, but they had last names that were different, which suggests to me that they bought them from, because this often would happen, you would buy a slave from the Potts, and the slave would retain the name the slave had with the first owner. Nanny, this is David Rogers Jr., if you look carefully. This is the son. And so, you know, you have, and David Rogers Jr., notice this, he's now the town clerk. So he's enrolling his own slave. And now here's Tamar Ann by John Delancey. Eliza by Gilbert Budd. Now, I don't think that Jack Purdy was Gilbert Budd's slave. So I just don't know what the story is here, but then here's George, son of Louis and Dorothea. Now, these are the Delancey's. And Benjamin. And this is the Merritts. And then this one here, this is Peter J. Monroe, and he's recording the birth on the 25th of May, 1814, of Charlotte, child of Nellie. Now, this birth had to have taken place at the manor house. That was where he lived. If it had happened in New York, he would have recorded it in New York. This was his property. So this is a document that said that there was a baby born to an enslaved woman in the manor house, and then the owner, Peter J. Monroe, registered the baby. I mean, this is... And then here is Anne or Nancy. I always wondered whether it was because he didn't remember the name. You know, oh, it was... But Judy Spikes suggested that Anne and Nancy are... One is a nickname of the other, and so I think that was the better... Now, two more slaves. Yes, 15 minutes to go. I'm gonna make it. This is terrific. Two more slaves. These are some of my favorites. In a way, this is a great story, and in a way, you have to. We'll have to see how it ends. But it's a story about slavery and the Revolutionary War, and all of these things are going to come to mean something in a moment. In the middle of the Revolutionary War, the Brits in 1775 proclaimed that all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, of course not if you were already our own, but free and that are willing and able to bear arms, they joining his Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to his Majesty's crown and dignity. In other words, he's basically saying to the slaves, hey, come on over. If you fight on our side, you'll be free when we win the war, and if we don't win the war, we will assure your freedom. And so 1779, the British commander got around to doing the same thing, which leads me to think that this was a pretty successful policy. So anyway, who are John Cox and Andrew Cole? They are slaves from Mamaroneck Township. And they joined up with the Brits. Now, John Cox was born in about 752 and was owned by Eleazar Godden. Godden doesn't appear in any records, but that's not unusual. There's lots of people whose names didn't get in these censuses. They had numbers, not names. But I think that John Cox might have been sold to Godden, originally been owned by someone last name Cox, and there are some Coxes in this community back then. Andrew Cole was born in 1757, owned by Ben Cole, and once again, thank you, Judy. Ben may have been a relative of James Coles, the Mamaroneck cobbler. Joseph and John Coles also appear in the 1790 census for Mamaroneck, so there's lots of Coles that might have owned him at a point in the past. They didn't have slaves in 1790. But they both joined up with the Brits. Now the war ends, and the Brits have lost. So there's the Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris, basically, the Continental Congress wanted the slaves returned to their owners. That was the Continental Congress's position on the matter. The Brits, it was George Washington's position. The Brits insisted that they would pay for them. They would pay for them, they would gather them up in New York, and they would take them to various places where they could resettle as free persons. And so there is a document called the Book of Negroes. It's a real book, not many copies. It is the manifest from New York of all of the ships taking the slaves that the Brits bought after the Revolutionary War and taking them largely to Nova Scotia. That's largely where they went. Now, John Cox and Andrew Cole were among the 3,000 black loyalists who were issued certificates of freedom and permitted to emigrate to Canada. Their ship, the Clinton, was bound for Annapolis, Nova Scotia. And when we first reported this on the Gazette, that's all we knew, because Nova Scotia had no disembarking documents about them. And so we thought we'd lost the trail. But we actually we visited up there, I did some, and there are historical societies up there. And after a while, I found some people who were actually reconstructing the records of the black loyalists up there, and they proceeded to identify that they had found Cox and Cole. Remember that the ship was bound for, let's see, where did I said it was bound for Annapolis. Well, basically it was also going to St. John. And turns out, see, they were signed out in the Book of Negroes. This is the actual, it's been scanned, and so here's the actual page where their names are written. John Cox and Andrew Cole and of Eliezer Garden, Mamaroneck, New York, and Ben Cole, Mamaroneck, New York. Once again, Mo was missing. And so they were aboard the Clinton, bound for Annapolis and St. John. And this is what they were called. He was called a stout fellow. And remember, they're both strong. And I always figured that if they grew up in Mamaroneck, they probably knew about the ocean. They knew they would do okay in Nova Scotia. They would, they would probably thrive there. Anyway, they didn't disembark in Annapolis. They went on to St. John. And Andrew Cole is listed is identified on a list of black loyalists arriving at St. John's. His name appears as Andrew Cole, and he's listed as having a wife. And then anyway, that tells you a little bit more about where they were, but it was an area up there. Now, in 1787, we see a petition to the government, the British government, asking for land for people who are freed slaves. And what do we find but right here, Jacob Cox and Andrew Cole. This is Cox and Cole. Now, I don't, I'll go into in a minute whether John Cox is the same as Jacob Cox. I mean, I think they are, and I'll give you some reasons. But basically, they met up on the boat with Richard Wheeler, whose middle name was CORANKAPONE. And CORANKAPONE, that was his African name that he gave to himself. And Richard Wheeler was educated, and he was smart, and he was assertive, and he became the leader of this group. And I suspect that this is exactly why Cox and Cole didn't get off in Annapolis. They wanted to stay with Richard Wheeler, with CORANKAPONE, and let him figure this all out. And so CORANKAPONE then explains in this document here that it's rough living. I mean, it really is, but that these people ought to be given slices of land to live on. Now, is Jacob Cox John Cox? And I won't go through all this stuff. You can see it on the website. We'll post this. But there are lots of reasons why Jacob and John should be the same thing, because they're always appearing, John and they're appearing, and Andrew Cole. The names are always together. There's good reason to believe it's the same person. There's also no evidence of Cox or Cole. The other guy didn't get out somewhere. Now, this is a bit about CORANKAPONE. He's a very interesting character. Anyway, there were about 210 black loyalists who sailed with him on the Clinton, and went to the new colony of New Brunswick. Now, what happens? Well, here's the land grant. They get their land. And here's the proof. Jacob Cox and Andrew Cole, right there in the document, they're two of the people who get the land. So they've gotten property. Now, the descriptions, there are lots of descriptions of life up there. Life was terrible. I mean, it was very cold. The land was very rocky. And also, there was a considerable amount of racism. Canada still had slavery. And so here you had all these people who were not slaves, but they treated them like slaves. They didn't want to allow them to come into town. Part of what's explained in CORANKAPONE's little essay here is that if you give them the land, they won't come into town. So anyway, we have the land grant. And then the question is, well, did they have families? Well, there's evidence from the roster on the Clinton, the manifest on the Clinton, that there was a Mary Coles on the boat. She was freeborn from Mosquito Cove, another like Rattlesnake Hill, another place where we want to sell real estate, a place now known as Glen Cove. Next time someone wants to buy a house in Glen Cove, you can say, you mean over in Mosquito Cove? And then Nellie Cox with 2 children. And she's a former slave, you know, she was owned. And we think, and the historical societies think, that Cox and Cole were, met these women during the war and married them, or, you know, or got basically, they became partners. Now, this is another, this is what happens next. And what Stephen Crane Davidson, who's a scholar in Black Loyalist history in Canada, says, first of all, he couldn't find any other Coxes in this period other than Jacob. But he did find a Jeremy Cox in 1806, who was on a marriage list. And, you know, the person is exactly the right age to be the child under 10 that's listed as the person who came on the Clinton. And so they think that there's good reason to think that this person is the next generation of our friend Cox. But, you know, there's no proof in that the lineage sort of ran out. They haven't, at least this is where they are in terms of what they would understand. Andrew Cole, it's a different story. They really didn't like it up there. I mean, they didn't like the way they were being treated. They didn't like the land. They didn't like the conditions. And they saw this ad for free settlement in the coast of Africa. And there was a stampede of people, of free black people who had been in the Book of Negroes, going down to Halifax to accept the offer of resettlement in Sierra Leone. And Richard CORANKAPONE Wheeler and 4 of his friends went the 400 miles to Halifax by foot to accept the offer. This is how badly they wanted to go. Now, Richard CORANKAPONE Wheeler now appears, they're digitizing, you know, part of studying slavery is that all of the records keep coming forward. You know, there's a new generation of records every year or two that are being digitized. And Richard CORANKAPONE Wheeler definitely was in Sierra Leone. He was being himself. He was a leader of people down there. He was elected to things. He was appointed to things. He was an important player in the black community in Sierra Leone for 20 or 30 years after he arrived. The question is someday, is Andrew Cole going to show up in one of those digitized documents? Or did he die in Canada? You know, this is what we don't know. But you know, when they said he was a stout man in the manifest, you know, these are people that could walk 400 miles. Of course, you have to wonder what happened to his wife, but, you know, this was years later. And so that's what we know. Now, today, there is a museum in Canada which honors the Black Loyalists, and it has a memorial to the evacuation of New York and the Book of Negroes, and Cox and Cole appear on the memorial. So 2 of our slaves are memorialized in Canada, and we should be proud of that. Furthermore, the place where they live where they lived in 2011, in November 2011. Well, it's got the name somehow. That was what, that's a place name because that's who lived there. It is now in one of Canada's historic places. And I won't go into the whole petition, but they discuss the fact that the living there was very difficult, and they discuss Wheeler, and they discuss going to Freetown, and they discuss the petition in here, and they basically tell the whole story. But Canada's really valuing this story and this place and these people. And I think that's good to know. Now, a few hints for more to see. First, I did mention that the Brooklyn Historical Museum is doing an exhibition, which would be worth seeing. Now, they're addressing more the period of emancipation, which would be after the period that I'm talking about. It would be in the first half of the 1900s. But that's a really neat show. There is slavery in New York, which is over, but it's still a website. And that's the New York Historical Society. Then this is something you won't know about, but it's coming up, and this is another professor at John Jay is doing John Jay's first, you've heard about these massive online open courses. Well, John Jay's doing one, and it's going to be done by John Madison, who is a member of our English department. He's both a lawyer and has a PhD in English, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for Eden's Outcasts, which is a biography of Louisa May Alcott and her father. It's very interesting, and is interesting to somebody who's interested in progressive movements and progressive thinking back then, because her father was quite a progressive. But anyway, he is doing the MOOC on the literature of law and slavery. And so what he's looking at is the legal principles behind it, what the leading American or the writers of the time had to say about it, and then literature about the perspective of slavery from the slave, and the Civil War, and the institution of slavery today in law and literature. And so that's the end. Now I'm open to. My goal has been to exhaust you of any possible question. But if someone has a question or two, we could do a couple, and then yes.
There's a great book called The First Emancipator by Andrew Levy. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't.
About a man named Tom Carter in Virginia who had a religious experience. He owned hundreds, thousands of slaves. He was a neighbor of Jefferson, Madison, and everything. And he decided that slavery was wrong. And one of the interesting things about the book, it's a fabulous book, but it was so hard to free your slaves. Mm-hmm. It was legally incredibly difficult, especially
in the South.
Yeah. I mean, you alluded to that here. It was difficult enough, but it wasn't as though you could just say you're free. Mm-hmm. It was a long legal process, and you had to go before a judge and get blah blah blah. I really wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
I think that's pertinent to what you were saying.
Yes.
I'd just like to make one comment. I think it's very unfortunate that a lot of the kids in our educational system in Larchmont and Mamaroneck are clueless about the history of this town and the things that you're talking about. I think my own stepson, he's in Rhinebeck. I called to his social studies teacher the idea that there was slavery in Mamaroneck, and he was grateful that I threw him into the website. But there's an incredible amount of history, and kids are totally ignorant, even going back to the early 17th century.
Well, in 2008, the question was how does this information come to the schools? How do we educate our youth about this? In 2008, the Historical Society did a program in which the students in social studies at the junior high school helped us, and they they actually assumed the roles of some of the slaves and some of the slaveholders and told about themselves, and it was a wonderful presentation. But we do try to be sure that the history teachers are aware of the resources that we have, and we are. One of the reasons we're doing all this tape recording is that we're going to be streaming this presentation on our website, and it'll be also played on LMC so that it's available if they want a lecture on slavery in Mamaroneck. Here it is.
I think that's a good thing, because it amazes me. This area is very rich in history. And the kids just really are totally, they're not exposed to it. And when you talk to them about it, they kind of like, they're
No.
surprised.
Yes, one more.
I so hope you'll do another and bring us through maybe post-Civil War, when we have families that are so rich in the history of the African American, like the Iser family. I'm sorry Pete's not here today. There's so much about his story, and he was here long before any of our families ever were, and they were free. And
Yeah, you know,
fascinating stuff.
I would love, the question is, what can we do to reconstitute more recent history? And I do think that it would be very interesting to reconstruct some of the family trees. My experience with that is the only way to do it is to access the people who have the memory, and to do things to capture their memories, because they're the ones that give you the leads as to where to go. Yes?
And also for kids, it's very exciting to learn about Larchmont role in the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
Because it was very important. I know from Judy Spike's work that was really, that's interesting.
It is, although there is no tunnel leading to the mausoleum. In case the mausoleum was built in the 1870s, so there was nobody to emancipate. But
there were
sure, but there was an informal, there was an abolitionist movement all across New England, yeah, and New York. One more and we're done.
I just wanted to alert people that there was an article in the New York Times in the past week, I think either this past Friday or a week ago Friday, and it's probably about the Brooklyn exhibit. It's
Yes.
something I've set aside to read. I haven't
Yes.
read it yet, but I
Yes,
just
it's
thought
a
I'd
terrific
mention it.
article. And they actually make the point about there being 30% slaves in Brooklyn.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.